I think one of the reasons people have so much trouble with hatching and cross-hatching is that we have a very limited view of what its purpose is. We see it as simply putting shade or shadow into our drawing. It's far more versatile than this, and in fact, it opens up many possibilities for us when we draw with an ink line than we would have otherwise, than we have any other way. There are not just many more effects we can create, but there are actual objects and subjects under certain conditions that we can draw with hatching that we really can't draw any other way. If we look at a scene such as this lich gate in front of a cottage with the morning sun behind it, so being backlit, most of it is actually in shade, and there are just a few parts of this scene that are catching the morning rays. So how can we draw this? And the answer is primarily through using hatching and cross-hatching. We need to see this in terms of values and edges. And the edges are ones that in many cases, particularly with all the foliage, are also best created through hatching. We can't draw all the detail. We can draw parts of it to suggest what's happening, but the effect of what we see in reality, in most cases, can be better achieved on the paper through hatching. So I'm using a 0.2mm pen because there's a fair amount of detail on a fairly small scale. But that also creates the problem that it's hard to get dark values very quickly, very easily, because the line is relatively thin. So that's going to be my challenge, to create enough darknesses in the, not so much the very dark areas because they're quite small, but some of the larger areas, particularly this bush in the front, which needs to have a fair bit of nuance in the way I draw it because it takes up so much of the space. If I go too light or too dark, if it's too all the same, then it's going to be more just a flat dark shape stuck in the front. It's such a prominent position, and it's really so key to the whole drawing. It's a great contrast in its shape and surface texture to the fence, to the architecture, even to the other trees and the grass in front, that I really want to try and have it feel three-dimensional, have it mostly sitting in the shade, but having a sense of the upper part catching the morning rays of the light. It really is one of the key elements in this scene. So that's going to be a challenge. Now, with this picket fence, again, we create it by hatching around it, by hatching the darker areas that we see through it. We draw the pickets as much by negative space, as much by actually drawing the gaps between as we do any other way. And I'm not getting hung up with carefully drawing each picket. In my experience, that ends up creating pickets that look both overdrawn and not well enough drawn at the same time. So I want to more create the effect of the pickets, and that's best done through the shadows. So I'm just, as you can see, mapping out the architecture. Started with the lich gate, drew it slightly too large, and so that's going to just push things out in all directions slightly. But if I work out the architecture, I don't want to get too bogged down in drawing the detail too precisely or with too much detail. I do want what I draw to be accurate, but I don't want to draw too much detail because basically all of the house is in shade of some type. But equally, it's the shade and the shadow and the darker base colour, the darker natural colour of the foliage around it that really is the key thing that makes the architecture stand out without having to be fussed with too much detail or drawing it too heavily. I do want a sense of 3 dimensions. I do want a sense of this bush is in front, the lich gate's behind it, that dormer window is further back again, and the fir tree, I think it is, behind it is further back again. And then we also have this tree on the right hand side, whose golden leaves are also catching the sunlight fully. And they're also one of the key parts to capture, to let the sunlight stand out with the darkness behind it. That patch on the lower right edge of golden leaves is the strongest contrast, I think, between light and dark. Those leaves and the shadows behind. So again, while I'm not going to be particularly drawing individual leaves, these leaves are relatively large and relatively close. So I will want to suggest a few of the shapes. But the important thing is not to put too much ink in doing that on those leaves, because I want the effect overall to be one of lightness when I put the darkness in behind. And I'm not particularly in all the places going as dark as I'm going to go just yet. And I haven't finished that front bush by any means. But I didn't want to finish it too quickly, too early in the drawing, in case there were issues with the rest of the drawing. But I'm using my normal technique of drawing from the inside out, starting with a small amount of detail and then radiating out from that using what I've drawn as my reference point. This drawing took me about 55 minutes to draw in real time, and you're watching it at 4 times the drawing speed. If you're finding this interesting, please hit the like button for me. That really helps me out for, well, not too much effort from you. So why not do it now, while we get into the second half of the drawing and we really start to push this hatch in. So the question people often seem to ask is, what direction should I hatch in? And of course the answer is whatever direction creates the best visual effect for the subject that we're drawing. And for the subject, that also includes the lighting. So what's dark, what's light, what's in shade, what's in shadow. But it also means the underlying form as well, because the hatch lines are a great way of producing a sense of 3-dimensionality in the objects, particularly when the objects have a very complex surface structure, such as this bush. It's basically a roundish blob, but the surface is definitely not smooth, and I want to try and capture that. And the edges are really important, the silhouette edges. So the most important one is that top one of that front bush, because we've got the darkness behind it. So I spent a fair bit of effort to try and create the jagged, toothy effect, but also not to make it look too even, because it is not even at all. So I'm really laying the groundwork for all this hatching for the foliage, and particularly in the left, the upper right side. Big challenge is not to have it just a tangle. I need to create some points where it's easy to see what's happening, and then I can be more ambiguous, if you like, further behind. As I draw these furthest trees that are on the far side of the house or behind the house, I'm consciously now trying to put less ink on the paper when I create dark values, not to have it as dark as I would have done if it were in the front or if it were closer, with the exception of this furthest dark part that's sort of I've just drawn. But it's still not going to be as dark as the darkness that's closer, where there's quite a lot of shadow being cast onto a verandahed area. It really is just quite black. And it also is what helps push the bush forward. So now I'm working on the bush more. I've done enough of the rest of the hatching that I feel like I want to see how the bush is going to look so that I can then use that to work out exactly what values I want for the foliage on the right hand side. And this is where it really is important to keep looking at my reference photo, and I'm drawing particularly the shadowed areas. I'm now trying to punch the darker areas in. And paying particular attention to the angle of the ground level at the base of the bush where there's some sort of grasses, or maybe it's a little very small shrubby plant growing up underneath the bush. I'm not exactly sure what, but I'm really now trying to almost not see this as a bush, but to just see it in terms of values and edges, and trying to just keep hatching so that I create those effects. Now I am going to come back and do a bit more, but I now want to do some more work adjusting the values on the right hand side. I often talk about in hatching the need to continually evolve over the whole area, because it's hard to know how dark to go in one place until we've seen how dark we've gone in another place. What I want is at the end of my drawing session that the darkest areas that I want, which is usually the darkest areas in the reference, are the darkest areas in my drawing. And the challenge is that the bush in front is not actually the darkest values that we have. So I don't want to make it too dark, but equally, the darker the values, the more they seem to come forward as well. So I want to be taking advantage of that and making some slight adjustments to life, to how it is in the photo. And if you haven't hit the like button, if you didn't do it last time, why not do it now? You've got time. Okay, so more hatching, and this is where I have to be really self-controlled now, not to hatch into the areas of white paper. Now that doesn't mean I can't put more ink in them, because I did want to make it a bit smaller and a bit more subtle, the variation of light. But I have to be really careful to go slowly with that. And I'm also now doing some hatching on the ground. That would have been easy to miss, but I think it's important because not so much because the hatching is so important, but the strip that's not being hatched, where there is a bit of sunlight hitting the ground, that's really important to create the effect of. And I can't draw the sunlight, but I can draw the darkness, the shaded or shadowed areas that make the sunlit area look even brighter. And so this is the manipulating one part against another. I hope you have a go drawing this. It's not an easy subject, but even just draw a part of it with the hatching and see how you go using hatching to actually create the drawing. You'll find this reference photo, of course, on my channel community page. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Hatching is really our friend. We can draw things using it that we can't really draw any other way. And if we try and draw scenes such as this, it can help us in the end to get over our hang-ups about hatching, to really push it and experiment, take risks with it, and learn what it can do for our drawing, the sort of subjects that it opens up for us as possibilities to draw, particularly things with a lot of foliage in quite complex combinations. But hey, in the end, however you use hatching, whatever you draw, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.